Welcome to Nerd Index. Today we're going to be talking about my favorite books or the kinds of books that I normally read and what that means for the kind of books that you would see me talking about on the channel in the future. So I read almost 100% in fiction, predominantly with the adult romance and fantasy and young adult fantasy genres. And I usually get through 50 to 100 books a year. Just kind of depends on how invested in reading I am that year. I prefer standalone novels, mostly because with the publishing cycle being so long, from book 1 to book 3, it's usually 3+ years, and I lose a lot of the connection with the characters and the emotions of the story in between those releases. So when it comes to series, I've started to wait until they've completely finished, even though I know from the publishing perspective that's bad for the authors, and a lot of times that can affect how the publishers will look at contracting them in the future. So it's not something that I would recommend for everyone, but for me, that's what I ended up having to do just to stay connected to the core of that story in a series. And that's why I prefer standalones. So I tend to read from the library, and I do prefer physical books, but digital books are obviously easier to get and you have usually less wait time. So because I read primarily from the library, the only books that I buy for myself now to be on my own shelves are books that I rate 5 stars. And so 5-star books to me are anything that I get really obsessed over, or I absolutely cannot put down, or the kind of books that, take the fog of depression away for a time while you're reading it. And they also, of course, have excellent writing and story progression and anything, foundational to the way that books are created is also top-notch in and of itself. And then my favorite tropes inside of the romance and fantasy genres are fake dating and friends to lovers. And the fantasy elements that I appreciate the most are dragons and witches, and I know that a lot of people say that vampires or specific creatures are usually more in the sci-fi category, but I find them to be more of a fantasy category. So to me, those are also some of my top favorites. So because I only purchase the 5-star books now, everything on my shelves is an example of all of my favorite books throughout the most recent years, because I started doing that around 2019. And there's a select few authors that I feel always deliver the best experiences, and so I am willing to pre-order outside of that 5-star rule, because almost every book I ever read from them is a 5-star for me. And one of those authors is Maggie Stiefvater. Maggie is a young adult author, although she is publishing an adult novel very soon, and she is the kind of author that has an extremely unique voice, and the stories that she tells are things that you're always sitting there thinking to yourself, where did she come up with this idea? And everything is so beautifully crafted, and it just takes you on such a journey. So I highly recommend all of her books, and anything that she does for her writing seminars is also really good. If you are interested in writing anything yourself, you will gain a lot of knowledge from any of the seminars that she's done or any that are coming up that you can buy access to. Another author that I always pre-order is Casey West. She writes mostly in the young adult contemporary romance spectrum. The books she writes are a little bit lighter in tone, but they also maintain a lot of emotional moments and twists, and her characters are always dynamic Another one of my favorite authors is Margaret Rogerson. Her fantasy novels are wonderful, absolutely spellbinding, and I highly recommend all of them yet again, but my absolute favorite is Vespertine, the most recent release. And if we get a rumored sequel, I will be very happy. Another one of my favorite authors is Tricia Levenseller. Her books are within the dark fantasy, dark romance spectrum of YA. The Shadows Between Us was my absolute favorite book of hers, but also her Daughter of the Pirate King series was one of the only times that I've enjoyed pirate books in my life. My absolute favorite adult romance author is Abby Jimenez, and her books are the kind of romance where they're very grounded in the real world, but they also feel very unique. Her books are always very hard to put down. They're so good, and her characters feel like they just come off the page as real people, and their struggles are so relatable, and the way that she resolves the conflicts in her stories is really satisfying, so you will always walk away from her books feeling better than you did at the start instead of feeling frustrated. Elise Kova writes really wonderful, romantic-y, new adult stories. Most of her characters are women in their early 20s, and they are usually part of really well-crafted magical worlds, as well as great magic systems and really well thought out romances. And my favorite series of hers is the Married to Magic series. Finally, we have Mimi Matthews, who writes adult romances, specifically historical Victorian era romances, and I came to her from the Bells of London series because I'm a horse girl at heart, and I really enjoyed how she connected the characters to their horses in each book, and the romances were also rather satisfying. Some of my favorite books that I've read so far for 2024, so my 5 stars for things that I've read this year, not specifically that published this year, would include The Darkness Within Us by Tricia Levenseller. It's the sequel to The Shadows Between Us, and it focuses on her sister Chrysantha. Being placed still in the world of The Shadows Between Us, we saw a lot of the characters from the first book returning, but we also saw Chrysantha as her own person, and she was definitely unique to her sister. I felt like diving into her character more deeply was really enjoyable, and I thought that her journey to finding her own romance was also very satisfying. Another one of my 5-star reads this year so far is Bride by Ali Hazelwood. This was obviously a vampire v werewolf dynamic of culture wars and trying to break down the barrier between them through marriage. It has a lot of those like fake dating, forced proximity elements in it that lead to a romance and a deeper understanding between the two main characters. And obviously if there's vampires, I will show up. I finally got around to reading the Smoke Thieves series by Sally Green. I very much enjoyed the Half-Blood series, and so when I got into this, I was overjoyed to find that the world building was amazing and every single character was so unique and diversified, and the story thread through the whole series was carried very well. The first book in particular was such a joy to read. I also read the City of Nightmares series from Rebecca Schaeffer. This was another vampire book, but it was vampires done differently through the spectrum of social conversation about consent and things like what some vampire tales and lore are saying to us subconsciously. And even though that was more of a subplot of the story, it was still an interesting perspective for somebody to take. And her main character, Ness, was also very interesting in her journey through overcoming her fears of the world around her. Then most recently I read Love Theoretically by Ali Hazelwood, who apparently is just going to be one of my favorite authors from this year. This is also the first year that I'm reading her, so I'm kind of getting caught up on her entire backlog. But Love Theoretically, I would say, is my favorite book of hers entirely. We're back to fake dating, and I really thought that their chemistry as a pair was good, and that they maintained a very interesting subplot about academia and the struggles of being a professor that, had been touched on a little bit here and there in some of the other books, but was a huge main focus here and was a very interesting backdrop for the romance as a whole. Some of the upcoming book releases that I'm looking forward to for pre-orders are A Dawn with the Wolf Knight. We're finally going to the Wolf Kingdom, and I am really looking forward to this subtle retelling of Little Red Riding Hood and seeing how Elise Kova handles the old fairy tale. I also ordered The Blood Orchid by Kylie Lee Baker, and I'm really looking forward to this continuation of The Scarlet Alchemist, especially because she's openly said that she used a lot of inspiration from Full Metal Alchemist in the crafting of the story. I am really looking forward to the culmination of everything that was built in the first book. Then we have The Muse of Maiden Lane, which I do believe will be the final installment of the Bells of London series, and I am looking forward to finally learning more about Stella and her horse and getting to know how her own romantic story or journey is going to play out. And of course, seeing the other girls as their stories progress in the background. Then I also pre-ordered Heavenly Tyrant by Ziran J. Zhao. It is the sequel to Iron Widow. This is another one that I read prior to my rule about waiting for a series to be over, but everyone was talking about Iron Widow so much when it first came out that I just had to jump on the bandwagon, and it was just as good as all of the hype claimed, and so I'm really looking forward to the continuation of the story there. And lastly, I have a pre-order for Holy Terrors, which will be the finale for Little Thieves from Margaret Owen, and I really cannot wait for April 2025 because I read the first book and then I told myself I need to stop, I need to wait because the books are very long and rereading them takes a very long time, so I cannot wait for the finale of this series as well. So those are some of my favorite authors, my favorite books from this year so far, and books that I'm looking forward to releasing in the future. And you can expect to hear me talking more about adult and young adult fantasy and romance books moving forward.